Hello and welcome to Edgetone Studios. One of my plans with the studio is to host some live streaming of bands in the future. And to get started working with video gear, I thought I'd start making a series of YouTube videos on studio gear that I have and the way I use it. I spent most of 2021 building this space. It's an addition on our home. There's a control room, tracking room, entry, washroom. And at the start of 2022, just after I'd completed the studio, got everything set up, I made the switch from Universal Audio Apollo interfaces as my primary recording interfaces to a Presonus StudioLive digital mixer. And after realizing the benefits of this switch, I went looking for other people who were also using the StudioLive as their mixer for their studio. And aside from Joe Gilder of Home Studio Corner, I couldn't find anyone else who was doing this. And so I thought I would start this series with why I switched to a digital mixer, and specifically the Presonus StudioLive Series 3, in this case the 32S. One of the biggest benefits of the StudioLive series of mixers is the sheer number of inputs and outputs available. On this model, the 32S, which is the second to the top of the line, there are a total of 32 channels of mic inputs, and those 32 channels have 32 physical faders and controls to manipulate them. As well, 16 of those channels could be used as line inputs instead. There's 2 auxiliary inputs, which are stereo. They could be used for additional line level sources. There's a tape input in stereo, which is RCA connections. It could be used for a tape deck. And as well, a Talkback mic input. On the output side, you get a total of 16 mix outputs and associated controls. Or you consider that 8 stereo sends for headphones or stereo external effects. There are also 4 subgroup outputs. There's the monitor out with a separate monitor control, a mains out, which is normally controlled by the mains fader, as well as a separate mono mains out, which is a sum of the stereo mix in mono. There are tape outputs, which mirror the main outputs by default, as well as an AES digital out in stereo, which also defaults to mirror the mains output. But any mix out or solo bus or tape input could be sent to the AES output, or it could be used for digital synchronization of other audio gear to keep the timing clocks aligned. So when I first got the studio set up and was working with the Apollo interfaces, I of course was using Apollo's console software to manipulate gain, fader levels, headphone mixes, and I became increasingly frustrated with the lack of physical control. And one of the big benefits I found for going to the StudioLive series mixer was the ability to have full physical control over my mixes, especially during tracking sessions. Each of the 32 inputs has a physical fader, a solo, and a mute button, as well as a fat channel control section. And the fat channel control section gets implemented whenever you select a channel. In this case, I've got stereo link channels, so you'll see 2 channels being selected at a time with those ones. In the case of a mono channel, it'll select 1 channel at a time. And once I've selected a channel, I can adjust its preamp gain, its panning, and then quickly adjust gate threshold, compressor, high pass filters, and EQ settings for low, mid, and high EQ settings, as well as access phantom power, phase inversion, stereo link the channels as odd even pairs, and so much more. So I don't have to reach for a mouse or look at a computer screen to set up a mix. I simply select a channel, adjust the gain for the source, set a fader level for the mains in the room, and continue on until I have a rough mix that I like. And then to set up a headphone mix, I would simply select the mix associated with that headphone, in this case mix 1 and 2 are linked to my headphone 1 monitor mix. And as soon as I do that, I could start mixing up the levels for the artist. Now, while doing that, I'm going to want to hear what the artists are hearing. So one of the other features is the ability to quickly edit the monitor mix. So by default, when I select the monitor edit, you see that the mains are what I'm going to be listening to. But I want to hear the headphone mix. I can simply come in and hit mix 1 and 2. And now I'll be listening to the headphone mix while I get it set up. And once that headphone mix is set up and I switch back to the mains, I can switch back to my main monitors and leave the headphone mix alone. As you can see, there's a 7-inch touchscreen on the unit for accessing pretty well any parameter that you might ever set. This can be used in conjunction with the physical controls or as an alternative to the physical controls. There's also a built-in Talkback button, so if you use an external Talkback mic for headphone sends, you have either a latch mode where you can leave it on and continually talk to the artists, or a temporary mode where you hold it down and let go when you're finished talking. And lastly, there's a set of transport controls that can be associated with your DAW of choice. To tie this all together is the concept of fader layers. So as you saw when I switched between the main mix and mix 1-2, the faders associated with mix 1-2 automatically come up and are set when I go into that mix. And the faders associated with the main mix come up when I go to that mix. That would also include the panning of those mixes or any other settings that would be not global for a channel, such as preamp gain. So with that in mind, you can have multiple mixes. In my case, I have 4 different stereo headphone amps set up. I have 4 free single mixes that could be used for future uses. I use mix 13 and 14 for my OBS recording software, so only the desk mic is going to that, and that's what's being recorded at this time. Mix 15 is a digital delay, external, and mix 16 is a reverb that's external. So I've got hardware tied in directly. I have physical control for setting the mix for that hardware, the mix for a video feed, the mix for headphone amps, and the main mix. So in a live situation, I could be sending a mix to the artists through their headphones, sending a mix to a live stream for video broadcasting, having a completely different or similar mix, if I chose, in the room to listen to. And on top of that, with the effects that are built in, there are 4 separate effects layers. So for each of these effects, you can choose an effects type, in this case a digital reverb, and set levels for everything that you want to send to that reverb, with a separate return for each of those other mixes and the main mix. Incredibly flexible routing potential, probably more than you're going to use in most situations, but the capabilities are there. One of the other unique features of the mixer is the user layer. With the user layer, you can rearrange the channels to be however you want for your workflow. In my case, I have a stereo return from my Mac, so that's a USB-based channel that's bringing back the sound from the Macintosh. I have a stereo return USB channel coming from Studio One, my DAW. I have a stereo return that's just the click sound from my DAW. Then I have several outboard preamps, all my synthesizers in one section, a couple drum machines, a vocoder, my effects returns for my external hardware, and then a summing bus mix to record back in when I'm running through an analog summing bus. Without the user layer, these are laid out completely differently, and they're laid out as individual channels. So in this case, my Poly Evolver shows up on channel 9 and 10, Super 6 shows up on channel 11, 12. In the user layer, my Poly Evolver shows up over here, with a single fader to control the stereo mix, and the Super 6 is right beside it with a single fader to control the stereo mix. So not only does the user layer allow you to rearrange things, it saves space by putting stereo mixes onto a single fader. Besides the 32 inputs that are set up on individual faders, so that every single analog input shows up on the main board, there's an X button that slides you over to look at some of the other additional channels. The first 4 are effects returns for effects A to D. The next 2 are the 2 auxiliary inputs. The next one is the tape input, and the last one is the talkback mic. Because it's a digital mixer, there's digital routing built in. So it's quite possible to send any input source to any output source. And an input source could be either analog or USB. So I've got Studio One as a USB return coming in onto the auxiliary 1 fader, rather than using the auxiliary 1 inputs at the back of the console, which I'm not using. I've got the click track from Studio One coming in on auxiliary 2's fader as a stereo click, and then I'm using the tape return as a USB return for my Macintosh. There's far more you can do with digital patching, but I'm not going to get into that in this video. Another feature of the digital mixer is low latency tracking. So what's latency? Latency is the delay that you experience when an audio signal has to be digitized, sent into a computer, processed by the computer, then undigitized and turned back into an analog signal and sent back out to the headphones or the amplifier. And that delay, no matter how slight, is always there. The problem with the delay is it can cause timing issues for the musicians who are listening to their own performance. So if the musician is singing and they're hearing their voice come back a fraction of a second later, it can really throw them off. Well, with the digital mixer and the StudioLive specifically, you don't have to worry about that. You don't even need a computer to be recording. All of the inputs and outputs are being processed by the mixer itself at a very high rate, so as to have next to no latency. There is latency because it's a digital mixer, but the latency is so low you're not going to hear it. As well, it's got a built-in SD card slot, and you could record directly to that SD card. So not even considered in my thought process for purchasing the unit is the fact that if on the day you're going to record a band, you get all set up and your computer suddenly fries, you don't have to completely stop the session. You could simply change all of your outputs to the SD card and track your analog sources to files on the SD card, and later bring those into your DAW and do your mixing. Another big benefit of the StudioLive Series 3 mixer is DAW control. So DAW stands for Digital Audio Workstation, as most of you probably know. And my digital audio workstation of choice is Studio One, which is also made by Presonus and integrates quite well with the StudioLive series. So, for example, here is a mix session I have where my fader levels are at the bottom of the screen, and I can use my mouse to manually grab a fader and slide it up or slide it down. But by going into DAW mode, I simply press the DAW button on the StudioLive Mixer, and suddenly all of my faders are mapped to the channels in Studio One. So what you'll see is that channel 1 is labeled full mix on the StudioLive. It's also full mix on the corresponding Studio One track. And when I move my faders, they move in the software. Now there's a bit of a delay in OBS, so it looks like it's lagging here, but in reality it's moving at the same time as I move the fader. So by doing that, you now have physical control over mixes. You can use that for automating mix levels, or for doing a live mix, maybe just your subgroups, and pulling them up on your console and adjusting levels as you're doing your mix in real time. So normally, when you're working with an audio interface, you can set your software to send outputs through the audio interface's outputs. But on a digital mixer, it's a little bit different because your mix outputs are tied to the various fader levels for things like headphone sends and external effects. And when you're in DAW mode, you don't necessarily want to be using those. You want to be using your external outputs to process signals coming from your software. So the way that Presonus has gotten around this is giving something called interface mode. So under System, there's the ability to turn on interface mode. Now, if I do that, it will disable my mix buses and therefore disable my desktop mic, and I won't be able to talk to you about it. So I'll pretend that I've turned on interface mode. And by doing that, when I go back into DAW mode and look at my software, I can then set up outputs in my software and map them to mixes on the console. So I've already done that in the settings, and now you can see I have individual faders for mix 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, all the way up to mix 15 and 16. And I use these as stereo outputs, which go to and are patched into my Burl Vancouver 32 channel mix bus. So that's an analog mix bus for me to do analog mix downs using the digital router. So basically my software sends bus information out each of these stereo outputs. They get processed by the Burl B32 Vancouver. From there, I take them through my Mag Audio EQ4 equalizer, and then use a Heritage Audio Successor compressor as the final compression on the mix. And then that's just patched back to a couple channels on the mixer. And in the case of this song, I've already done a full mix and printed it onto a track in the software. Now, to some extent, I completely glossed over the fact that the digital mixer has built-in effects. I did mention there are 4 effects buses, and each of those effects buses has digital effects associated with it. Well, why is this useful when you already have plugins? Well, when you're doing tracking sessions, the vocalist might often want a little bit of reverb. Someone might want a little bit of delay on their signal, and you can quickly set up a mix and send it to them using the built-in digital effects. And you get 4 different reverbs, 3 different delays, a chorus, and a flanger. So you could set up whatever combination of 4 digital effects you want and have independent mixes for each of them and have the resulting sum of those effects sent to whichever mix buses or mains output you want to. But on top of that, there's a bunch of benefits I wasn't really expecting when getting the mixer. One of which is the idea of digital patching. Now, I gave you a sample of that with the idea of the user layer where you could rearrange faders any way you want. But with the digital patching, which is accessed through the console here, you could take any input source and route it to any available output. So down the right-hand side of the panel here, you can see that sources include the solo bus left and right, the mains output, subgroups A, B, C, and D, the 4 different effects, mixes 1 to 16, the talkback, the tape input, auxiliary 1, auxiliary 2, and all 32 channels. And any of those could be assigned to USB outputs, analog mixes, or various input sources. So when you patch in your cables, you have a lot of flexibility in how that then maps out onto your mixing console. And if you connect your StudioLive interface to your network and have a Wi-Fi connection in your studio, then you can provide remote control access to headphone mixes to your clients. So there's an app for Android or iOS called QMix UC from Presonus. And when you go into QMix, by default you see a jog wheel and two levels, one saying me, the other saying band. You go to the next page and you choose which input is me, as in, say, a vocalist, and then they can scroll up and down on this wheel to adjust more level of themselves to the band or less level of themselves. That's the simplest way. Or by turning the phone or tablet sideways, they can have individual access to various faders on their mix. So in this case, I'm looking at phones 1, which for me is mix 1 and 2, which I've already selected. And by moving these faders around, I'm really adjusting the mix on the mixing board. So it's a fantastic way to provide clients with more access to their headphone mixes. And besides that, there's a tablet app called UC Surface, which is more geared for the engineer to use, where it can allow full physical control over the mixing console from a Wi-Fi connection. And these are permission based, so you can set it so that your device can only access UC Surface and client devices can only access their particular QMix send. Lastly, there is the idea of scenes. I wasn't considering that I might need to save different setups for different sessions when I was purchasing the mixer. I really just wanted the physical controls and the number of inputs that it had. But with scenes, you get projects and then scenes within the project. And when you save a scene, by default, you're saving all the fader settings, you're saving all the digital patching, you're saving all the auxiliary mappings, you're saving the effects levels, you're saving the effects choices. And if you set up a different scene every time you have a different band come in to record, you can have all their levels set up the way you want it. As long as you know what was plugged in where at the time that you recorded that band, you can quickly recall their scene and be ready to record again the next time they come in. This way you don't have to necessarily book a set of musicians to be day after day for their recording. They could come in one day, come back a week later, you could have someone else in between and not be worried about changing too many settings on your audio interface. Now let's talk about the cost comparison between Apollo Universal Audio gear and the Presonus StudioLive series. Now I had an Apollo X8P and an Apollo X16 and 500 series modules to give me my 32 inputs that I wanted for all my synthesizers and the various microphones in the tracking room. But if you just look at the Apollo X8P, which provides 8 mic line combo jacks, the current heritage version goes for $48.99 Canadian, and this same StudioLive Series 3 mixer goes for $47.99 Canadian, but you're going to get 16 mic inputs and 16 mic line inputs, plus 16 mix outputs, 16 physical outputs, digital effects built in, the ability to save scenes, the ability to have remote control, physical controls for everything you're going to be working with. To me, it's a no-brainer that the StudioLive series is a better value than the Universal Audio. Well, what don't you get? There's a couple things. For example, if you need high resolution audio of 88.2 or 96 kilohertz, you're not going to get it on the StudioLive. They only do 44.1 and 48 kilohertz. But for regular audio processing, for anything that's going to be streaming quality, CD quality, you don't need anything more than that. This doesn't have 5.1 output. It doesn't have the ability to support 5 speakers and a subwoofer. So this is really only useful for mixing environments where it's going to be stereo. One of the annoyances on the mic pre's and the line inputs is that there's no pad for the input. So you have to make sure your source is not too hot. Otherwise, you're going to have to find a way to reduce it with an external device or turn it down at the source. And the desk itself really does take up a lot of physical real estate. this might not work for everyone. But if you like physical control, you're going to need some space for it. But there is another version that's the 32SC, which really is only a 16 input, 16 fader board that could be expanded to 32 inputs through the audio video bridging network. I guess the last thing that I would think would be potential negative is the sheer amount of routing and input and output potential in the unit makes it that it's complicated to set up. When I first started working with this, I was wishing it was a lot simpler. Now that I've been working with it for over 6 months, I'm happy it's as complicated as it is, because I've been able to set up my studio to fit my workflow and then be simpler to operate because it's set up exactly the way I want it. I haven't had to make any compromises of how anything is set up. So I hope you've enjoyed this tour of the StudioLive 32S mixer. There's so much more to it than I covered, but I tried to cover the main points and cover them in a way that would be useful for people looking into this. I'll put a link below to Joe Gilder's playlist of his videos on the StudioLive 24, which is a slightly older mixer, but it's also the Series 3 mixer. They just don't make that model anymore. And if you have any questions or comments, leave them below and I'll try and get back to you. Thanks for watching.